Evicted in the middle of a freezing night, Daniel Mercer had nothing left but his old pickup and Rex, his German shepherd, until he remembered the one place he swore never to return, his grandmother's forgotten house at the edge of town, the air inside thick with dust and silence as if time had been holding its breath. But Rex suddenly froze, ears sharp, staring at the basement door no one had opened in years. Then slowly, he scratched once, twice, like he was answering something calling from below. Daniel hesitated, heart pounding, before forcing the rusted door open, and the moment it creaked wide, Rex bolted down into the darkness, stopping at a hidden panel in the wall, and what Daniel found behind it made his hands tremble, because it wasn't just money, it was something his grandmother had been protecting all along. Sometimes, the places we avoid the most are the ones still waiting to save us. The night Daniel Mercer was evicted, the cold came in fast, biting through his worn flannel as he stood on the sidewalk with everything he owned packed into 2 duffel bags, the landlord's porch light flicking off behind him like a final door closing on a life that had already been slipping away for years, and beside him, Rex sat quietly, his breath steady in the freezing air, amber eyes watching not the street, not the passing cars, but Daniel himself, as if measuring something deeper than loss, something harder to name. The kind of silence only follows men who've survived too much and returned with too little, and for a long moment Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the cracked pavement beneath his boots as if it might offer direction, but it didn't, it never did. So he reached for the one memory he'd spent years trying to forget, a small house on the edge of a dying town, where the trees grew too close and the wind always seemed to carry whispers through the branches. His grandmother's house, the last place that had ever felt like it belonged to him, and the one place he had sworn never to return. But desperation has a way of reopening doors pride once nailed shut, and by dawn, his old pickup was rolling down a narrow road lined with frostbitten fields, the engine rattling like an old soldier refusing to quit, much like the man behind the wheel. The sky stretched pale and endless above him, a thin winter light barely warming the land, and Rex sat beside him, alert but calm, nose twitching at something Daniel couldn't sense, as if the dog already knew they weren't just going back to a house. They were being led somewhere. The tires crunched over gravel as the house came into view, smaller than Daniel remembered, leaning slightly as if time itself had grown tired of holding it upright, paint peeling, windows dim, the whole place wrapped in a quiet that felt too still, too patient, like it had been waiting. And when Daniel stepped out, the air carried that same faint scent he remembered from childhood, dust, cedar, and something older, something buried beneath years of silence. He pushed the door open and it creaked in protest, the sound echoing through empty rooms that hadn't heard footsteps in a long time. And for a moment he just stood there, listening, not to anything obvious, but to the weight of the place itself, the way the floorboards held stories, the way the walls seemed to breathe in slow, measured patience. And then Rex stopped, right in the center of the living room, ears rising, body still, gaze locked on a single point across the room, the basement door, and he didn't bark, didn't growl, just watched, like he was remembering something Daniel had never known. And after a few seconds, he took one slow step forward and pressed his nose lightly against the wood, then scratched once, soft, deliberate, not a warning, not fear, but something else entirely, something that made the air shift in a way Daniel couldn't explain, and without realizing it, Daniel felt his own breath slow, his heartbeat sinking with the quiet pull of that moment, because somehow, deep down, he knew this wasn't just a house anymore, and whatever waited behind that door had been waiting for him far longer than he had been running from it. Daniel did not move right away, his hand hovering near the cold metal handle as if the door itself carried a memory he was not ready to face. The wood beneath Rex's paw faintly scratched from years of use, or perhaps years of waiting, and the silence in the house seemed to lean closer, listening, the way it had when he was a boy lying awake in the back room, hearing the faint creaks below that his grandmother always dismissed with a gentle smile and a quiet, old houses talk if you listen long enough. But this did not feel like the harmless settling of beams or the wind slipping through cracks. This felt measured, patient, like something that had not forgotten him even after all these years. And Rex glanced back at him once, just once, amber eyes steady and certain, not asking, not urging, simply knowing, and that was what unsettled Daniel the most, because Rex had always been precise in his instincts, trained to detect what others missed, vibrations, subtle shifts, things hidden beneath layers of silence. And if the dog was telling him something mattered, then it did, even if Daniel did not yet understand why. So he exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the dim light, and wrapped his fingers around the handle. The metal cold enough to sting, then pulled, the hinges resisting at first before giving way with a long, tired groan that seemed to echo deeper than it should have, as if the sound traveled beyond the walls and into something older beneath the house. The smell rising up from below thick and layered, not just dust and damp wood, but something mineral, something buried, like earth that had not been disturbed in decades. And for a moment he just stood there at the threshold, the darkness below swallowing the narrow staircase, each step disappearing into shadow, and he remembered, standing here once as a child, small and curious, reaching for the same door before his grandmother's voice called him back, firm but not unkind, telling him some doors were meant to stay closed until the right time, and he had never asked what she meant, never returned to the question. Life had carried him too far and too fast for things like that. But now, standing there again with nothing left to lose, the words returned with a weight he could not ignore, and Rex stepped forward first, placing one careful paw onto the top step, then another, moving with a quiet confidence that made the darkness feel less like a threat and more like a path already chosen. And Daniel followed, one hand brushing the wall for balance as the wood shifted slightly beneath his boots, each step producing a low creak that echoed upward and then vanished into the stillness above, the air growing cooler as they descended, heavier, carrying that same faint metallic scent that lingered just beneath awareness. And when they reached the bottom, Daniel paused again, letting his eyes adjust, shapes slowly forming out of shadow, old shelves lined with jars long emptied, a workbench coated in dust, a single bare bulb hanging from a cord overhead, swaying almost imperceptibly as if disturbed by a movement he had not seen. And he reached up and pulled the chain, the light flickering once, twice, before settling into a dim glow that revealed more than he expected and less than he needed. Because nothing about the space felt abandoned, not truly. The dust was too even, the air too still, as if time had been carefully placed here rather than left to decay. And Rex moved without hesitation, crossing the floor with slow, deliberate steps, nose low, tracing a path that did not follow the obvious layout of the room but instead cut diagonally toward the far wall where the foundation met a row of old wooden panels. And Daniel watched him, a strange tension building in his chest, the kind that came before something shifted, something that could not be undone. And when Rex reached the wall, he stopped again, head tilted slightly, ears forward. Then he pressed his nose against a single plank and held it there, not scratching this time, not barking, just waiting. And Daniel felt it then, not a sound, not a movement, but a subtle difference in the space, as if the air itself changed texture near that spot, thicker, quieter, like a held breath. And he stepped closer, his boots brushing against the concrete floor, the faint scrape echoing more than it should have. And when he reached the wall, he ran his hand along the wood, fingers tracing the grain until they caught on something slight, a gap so small it would have been easy to miss, a seam where one panel did not quite align with the rest. And his pulse quickened, not from fear but from recognition, the same instinct that had kept him alive in places where hesitation cost too much. And he pressed against the plank gently at first, then with more pressure, and for a second nothing happened, the house holding its silence, until a soft click broke through, quiet but unmistakable, and the panel shifted inward just enough to reveal a narrow space beyond, darkness layered behind darkness. And Rex stepped back, sitting now, watching Daniel with that same steady gaze, as if the next step was his alone to take. And Daniel hesitated only for a heartbeat before pulling the panel wider, the hidden space opening slowly, revealing not a hollow crawl space or forgotten storage, but something far more deliberate, the faint outline of a small room carved into the foundation itself. And within it, shapes began to emerge as the dim light reached inside, a metal box set carefully on a low shelf, its surface worn but intact, and beside it, something else, something wrapped in cloth that had been preserved with care, and Daniel felt his breath catch, not because of what he saw, but because of what it meant. This had never been random, never been forgotten. It had been kept, protected, waiting, and as he stepped forward into the hidden space, the air seemed to settle around him in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the house itself recognized his presence. And somewhere above, the faintest shift of wood echoed through the ceiling, not loud enough to startle, just enough to remind him that this place was not empty, not in the way he had believed, and perhaps never had been. And he realized then that whatever his grandmother had left behind was not just an object or a secret, it was a message, one that had waited patiently through years of silence for the moment he would finally be ready to hear it. Daniel did not reach for the metal box right away, his hand hovering just inches above it, as if something unseen held it in place, not with force, but with meaning, the kind that settles deep in the chest before the mind can catch up. And for a moment, he simply stood there, listening, not to any sound he could name, but to the quiet pressure of the space itself, the way the air seemed to gather around that small room like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And behind him, Rex remained still, seated just outside the threshold, his presence steady, grounding, as if he understood that whatever came next belonged to Daniel alone. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have, before finally lowering his hand to the surface of the box, the metal cool but not cold, worn smooth along the edges as though it had been handled many times, though not recently. And when his fingers curled around the latch, he hesitated again, not out of fear, but out of something closer to reverence, a quiet awareness that once opened, this moment could not be returned to what it was. And then, with a small, deliberate motion, he lifted the latch, the sound, soft but clear, echoing lightly against the narrow walls. And the lid gave way without resistance, opening slowly as if it had never been meant to stay closed forever. And inside, there was no flash of gold, no immediate sign of wealth or spectacle, only a collection of carefully arranged items, each placed with intention, each preserved as if time had been instructed not to touch them. A bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small leather-bound journal, and beneath them, something wrapped in a piece of cloth that looked older than anything else in the room, its edges worn but clean, as though it had been protected with care. And Daniel felt a subtle shift inside him, not disappointment, not relief, but something quieter, deeper, the sense that whatever this was, it mattered in a way he had not expected. And he reached for the letters first, the ribbon loosening easily beneath his fingers, the paper inside yellowed with age but still intact, the handwriting steady and familiar in a way that made his chest tighten before he even read the first word, because he recognized it. The same careful script his grandmother had used when she left notes on the kitchen table, reminders written in ink that never smudged, messages that always felt more like guidance than instruction. And he unfolded the first page slowly, the paper soft beneath his hands, and began to read, the words pulling him in with a quiet clarity that left no room for doubt, not about who had written them, not about who they were meant for. And as his eyes moved across the lines, something in the room seemed to settle, the faint tension that had lingered in the air easing into something almost like acceptance, as if the house itself recognized that the message had finally found its way home. And the words spoke not of secrets in the way he had expected, not of hidden wealth or sudden fortune, but of patience, of choices made quietly over time, of a life lived with intention even when no one else was watching. And woven between those lines were fragments of things he did not fully understand yet, references to keeping something safe, to waiting until the right moment, to trusting that the path would lead him back when he needed it most. And Daniel felt his throat tighten, slightly as he read, not from sadness, but from recognition, because he had spent so many years moving forward without direction, believing that whatever he had lost could not be found again. And yet here it was, not restored, not replaced, but waiting, just beneath the surface of a life he had almost abandoned. And he lowered the letter slowly, his gaze drifting to the journal beneath it, the leather cover worn but strong, edges softened by time. And when he opened it, the pages revealed something different, not messages this time, but records, detailed entries written with care, dates stretching back decades, notes about land, about names he did not recognize, about agreements and places marked with quiet precision, and Daniel's pulse shifted, a different kind of awareness rising now, not just emotional, but practical, the realization that whatever his grandmother had been protecting was not simply memory. It was something built, something maintained over time, something that had required intention and discipline. And as he turned another page, a small piece of paper slipped loose from the binding, falling gently to the floor near his boot, and Rex stood immediately, stepping forward just enough to nudge it closer with his nose. Not urgent, not alarmed, just certain, and Daniel bent down to pick it up, unfolding it carefully, his eyes scanning the brief lines written there, coordinates, precise and unmistakable, along with a single sentence beneath them, written in the same steady hand. When you find this, you are ready. And Daniel felt something shift again, not just within him, but around him. The room no longer feeling hidden or closed, but open in a way that extended beyond the walls, as if this small space had always been a doorway rather than a destination. And he looked back at the box, at the remaining cloth-wrapped item still, resting beneath everything else, untouched, waiting, and for a moment he did not reach for it, because he understood now that whatever it contained was not separate from what he had already found. It was part of the same path, the same quiet unfolding that had begun the moment Rex stopped at the door above, and perhaps long before that. And he realized then that he had not been brought here to uncover something random or accidental. He had been led, step by step, through loss, through silence, through a life that had stripped away everything unnecessary until only this moment remained. And as he stood there, the faint light above casting long shadows across the floor, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not certainty, not control, but direction, a quiet sense that the next step was already waiting for him to take it. Daniel remained still for a long moment, the small piece of paper resting lightly between his fingers, the coordinates etched into his mind with a clarity that felt almost unnatural, as if they had been waiting there long before he ever saw them. And the sentence beneath them lingered even heavier. When you find this, you are ready. Not written as a question, not offered as a suggestion, but stated with the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen the outcome unfold. And Daniel let out a slow breath, the kind that carried years of weight with it, his gaze drifting back to the cloth-wrapped object still resting inside the box, untouched, patient, and for a moment he hesitated again, not because he feared what it might be, but because he understood now that every step forward changed something inside him. And once changed, it could not be undone, and Rex shifted slightly behind him, not restless, not urging, just present, the faint sound of his breath steady in the quiet room, grounding Daniel in a way nothing else had in a long time. And finally, Daniel reached down and lifted the cloth-wrapped item carefully, the fabric soft, but firm, tied with a simple knot that came loose with minimal effort. And as the cloth unfolded, it revealed not something grand or overwhelming, but something small, precise, a metal key, aged but polished, its surface catching the dim light in a way that felt almost deliberate. And attached to it was a thin tag, worn at the edges, with a single word engraved into it, a name he recognized immediately, not because it was familiar in his daily life, but because it had existed quietly in the background of his childhood, spoken only once or twice in passing conversations he had never fully understood, a place his grandmother had mentioned as if it mattered, but never explained why. And Daniel's chest tightened slightly as that memory surfaced, the sound of her voice soft and certain, telling him that some things were not meant to be rushed, that understanding came when it was needed, not when it was wanted. And now, standing in that hidden room beneath the house, holding a key that clearly belonged to something beyond it, he began to understand what she had meant, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that this was not the end of what she had left behind. It was only the beginning, and he closed his fingers around the key, feeling its weight settle into his palm, heavier than it should have been for its size, not physically, but in meaning. And he glanced back at the journal, at the letters, at the carefully arranged pieces of a life that had been building something quietly for decades. And for the first time since he stepped into the house, Daniel did not feel lost, not in the way he had out on the street, not in the way he had for years before that. Because even though he did not yet know where those coordinates would lead or what the key would unlock, he knew that, There was a path now, one that had been prepared long before he was ready to walk it, and that knowledge settled into him with a quiet steadiness, the kind that did not demand answers but offered direction, and he turned slightly, stepping back out of the hidden space. The panel still open behind him, the dim light casting long shadows across the basement floor, and Rex stood as soon as Daniel moved, tail low but relaxed, eyes watching him with that same calm awareness, and for a brief second, Daniel almost expected the dog to return to the wall, to signal something else, another hidden layer waiting to be uncovered, but Rex did not. Instead, he simply walked to Daniel's side and stopped, as if acknowledging that whatever came next was no longer hidden beneath their feet. It was somewhere beyond the house itself, and Daniel nodded faintly, more to himself than to the dog, the motion small but certain, and he reached up to pull the chain of the light, the bulb flickering once before dimming into darkness, the room settling back into its quiet, the hidden space no longer concealed but no longer needed to be revealed again. And as he made his way up the stairs, each step felt different than the ones that had brought him down, lighter in a way that did not come from relief but from purpose. And when he reached the top, the house greeted him with the same stillness, but it no longer felt empty. It felt complete, like a story that had finally been told to the person it was meant for. And Daniel stepped into the living room, the early afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows, casting a pale glow across the worn floorboards, and he paused there for a moment, looking around at the space that had once felt like a place he needed to escape from, and now felt like a place that had quietly been guiding him back all along. And he slipped the key into his pocket, along with the folded paper of coordinates, the two objects resting together as if they had always belonged side by side. And outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying a sound that was almost like a whisper, not loud enough to be understood, but clear enough to be felt. And Daniel stepped toward the door, Rex already moving ahead of him, the dog's posture calm but purposeful, as if he knew that whatever waited at the end of those coordinates was not just another place. It was the next piece of something much larger, something that had been set in motion long before Daniel lost everything, and perhaps long before he ever realized he would need to find it. The road stretched ahead in a quiet line of pale gravel, cutting through fields that had long since stopped pretending to be alive, and Daniel drove without turning on the radio, without reaching for anything to fill the silence. Because for the first time in years, the silence did not feel empty. It felt full, like it was holding something just beyond reach. And beside him, Rex sat upright in the passenger seat, eyes forward, ears shifting with subtle precision, as if tracking something Daniel could not see. The folded paper with the coordinates resting on the dashboard, its edges lifting slightly each time the truck rattled over uneven ground, and Daniel glanced at it more than once, not because he doubted it, but because he could not ignore how exact it felt, how deliberate, like a set of instructions written not just to guide him somewhere, but to meet him there at the exact moment he would be ready. And the miles passed slowly, the landscape changing almost imperceptibly from open fields to clusters of thin trees, their branches bare and reaching, casting long shadows across the narrow road. And the sky above remained a dull winter gray, the kind that softened everything beneath it into muted tones, as if the world itself was holding back, waiting to see what he would do next. And Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel slightly, the familiar hum of the engine grounding him in something real, something steady, even as the sense of direction he felt now had nothing to do with maps or roads, and everything to do with something deeper, something that had been quietly set in motion long before he understood it. And after nearly an hour, the road began to narrow further, the gravel giving way to a rougher path that looked less traveled, less certain. And Daniel slowed the truck, the tires crunching more deliberately now, until finally, the coordinates aligned with a place that did not look like much at all, just a break in the tree line where the land dipped slightly, forming a shallow clearing surrounded by tall, silent pines. And he brought the truck to a stop, the engine idling for a moment before he turned it off completely, the sudden quiet settling over everything like a blanket, thick and complete. And Rex was already alert, his body leaning forward slightly, not tense, not alarmed, but aware in a way that carried purpose. And Daniel reached for the paper again, reading the numbers one more time, confirming what he already knew. This was the place, and yet nothing about it immediately revealed why. No structure, no obvious sign. Just earth and trees and a stillness that felt too deliberate to be empty. And he opened the door, stepping out into the cold air that carried the faint scent of pine and something else beneath it. Something metallic, something familiar from the basement, and Rex jumped down beside him, landing softly, nose already lifting as he scanned the space. Moving not randomly, but with quiet intention, tracing a path that curved slightly toward the center of the clearing, and Daniel followed without speaking, his boots pressing into the thin layer of frost that cracked softly. Under each step, the sound small but sharp in the otherwise complete silence, and when Rex stopped, it was sudden, his body still, head angled slightly downward as he focused on a single spot in the ground, and Daniel felt it again, that subtle shift in the air, the same one from the basement, not visible, not audible, but undeniable once you noticed it, and he stepped closer, crouching slightly, his eyes scanning the ground, and at first he saw nothing unusual, just dirt, scattered pine, needles, and a few small stones. But then his fingers brushed against something just beneath the surface, something smooth, something not shaped by nature, and he cleared away the top layer carefully, revealing the edge of a metal plate set flush with the ground, its surface worn but intact, blending just enough with the earth to remain unnoticed unless you knew exactly where to look, and Daniel's pulse steadied rather than quickened, the moment feeling less like a discovery and more like a confirmation, as if the place itself had been waiting for him to arrive and recognize it, and he reached into his pocket, pulling out the key, the metal catching the pale light as he held it, and for a brief second he hesitated, not because he questioned what it would unlock, but because he understood that this was another threshold, another step that would carry him further into something he could not fully see yet, and Rex shifted beside him, stepping closer but not interfering, his presence steady, grounding, and Daniel let out a slow breath before lowering the key toward the small, almost invisible keyhole set into the plate, the fit exact, immediate, as if it had never belonged anywhere else, and when he turned it, the mechanism responded with a soft, internal click, followed by a low, subtle shift beneath the ground, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to signal that something had been set in motion, and Daniel felt it through his boots, a faint vibration that traveled upward, not unsettling, but alive in a way that made the space around him feel suddenly deeper, as if the clearing was no longer just a piece of land, but an entrance, and slowly, almost reluctantly, the edges of the plate began to separate from the earth, lifting just enough to reveal a narrow seam of darkness beneath, and Daniel's gaze fixed on it, his breathing steady, his mind quiet in a way it had not been in years, because whatever waited below was no longer a question of chance or coincidence. It was part of something that had been built, protected, and left behind with intention, and now, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, it belonged to him. The ground did not open all at once. Instead it moved slowly, deliberately, as if whatever lay beneath understood the weight of being revealed, the metal plate rising just enough to allow a narrow gap of darkness to breathe upward into the cold air, and Daniel stepped back slightly, not out of fear but out of respect for the quiet precision of the moment, the faint vibration still lingering beneath his boots, subtle but steady, like the echo of something alive deep below the surface, and beside him, Rex remained calm, his posture grounded, ears alert but not tense, watching the opening not as a threat, but as something familiar, something expected, and Daniel lowered himself carefully, brushing away more dirt from the edges until the plate could be lifted fully, revealing a concealed entrance just wide enough for a person to pass through, a set of narrow steps descending into shadow, carved with intention, not rough or accidental, but crafted, each edge clean despite the years that must have passed since anyone last used them, and the air that rose from below carried that same scent he had noticed before, mineral, still, and untouched by time in a way that felt almost impossible, and Daniel reached into the truck behind him, retrieving a small flashlight from the glove compartment, the metal cold in his hand as he clicked it on, the beam cutting cleanly into the darkness, revealing the first few steps before fading into deeper shadow, and for a brief moment, he stood there at the edge, looking down into something that felt less like a place and more like a continuation of a story he had only just begun to understand. And Rex stepped forward again, placing one paw on the first step, then another, moving slowly, carefully, as if acknowledging the importance of what lay ahead, and Daniel followed, the sound of his boots echoing softly against the enclosed space. The light from above fading quickly as they descended, replaced by the steady glow of the flashlight. And, with each step, the outside world seemed to fall further away, the wind, the trees, the sky, all replaced by a quiet that was deeper, heavier, not empty, but full of something unspoken. And when they reached the bottom, the space opened slightly into a narrow corridor, the walls reinforced with aged wood and stone, the craftsmanship careful and precise, not rushed, not temporary, but built to last. And Daniel paused, letting the beam of light move slowly across the surfaces, taking in the details, the way the walls held firm, the way the air remained still, as if nothing here had ever been disturbed. And Rex moved ahead of him, not far, just enough to guide, his steps measured, his nose lifting occasionally, as if confirming something invisible. And Daniel followed, each step steady, his mind quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. And after several yards, the corridor opened into a small chamber, larger than he expected, the ceiling high enough to stand comfortably, the floor smooth, and along one wall, shelves lined with objects that caught the light in subtle ways, metal, wood, glass, each item placed with care, not cluttered, not forgotten, but preserved. And Daniel's breath slowed as he took it in, not overwhelmed, but aware, deeply aware that this place had been built with purpose, not for hiding alone, but for keeping something safe, something that mattered beyond simple value. And he stepped closer to the shelves, the beam of the flashlight revealing details slowly, a collection of documents sealed in protective cases, small boxes labeled with names he did not yet recognize, and tools that looked both ordinary and significant at the same time, each piece part of something larger, something organized, something intentional. And then his light fell on the far wall, where a single object rested apart from the others, mounted at eye level. A framed map, its surface aged but clear, lines and markings drawn with precision. And Daniel stepped closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied it, recognizing the shape of the surrounding land, the roads, the fields, but also noticing the additional markings layered over them, paths that did not appear on any standard map, locations marked with symbols he had seen before, in the journal, in the notes his grandmother had left behind. And something inside him shifted again, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition. The quiet realization that this was not just a hidden place, it was a system, a network of something larger than a single house or a single secret. And he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the frame, feeling the solid weight of it, the reality of it. And behind him, Rex stopped moving, his body still, his attention focused not on the map, but on something else, something just beyond the immediate light. And Daniel turned slowly, following the dog's gaze, the beam of the flashlight sweeping across the room until it settled on a small, closed door set into the far corner, almost blending into the wall, unremarkable at first glance, but now impossible to ignore. And Daniel felt that same quiet pull again, the same sense of being guided rather than lost. And he took a step toward it, the air in the room seeming to shift once more, not in warning, but in invitation, as if whatever lay beyond that door was the next piece waiting to be found, and perhaps the piece that would finally explain why his grandmother had built all of this in the first place. Daniel did not rush toward the door, even though something in him urged forward, something quiet but persistent, like a memory that had waited too long to be remembered. And instead he slowed his steps as he approached, the beam of the flashlight steady in his hand, revealing the fine details of the surface. The wood aged but intact, its grain running in long, deliberate lines that suggested it had been placed here with care rather than convenience. And there was no handle in the usual sense, no obvious way to open it, just a small indentation at the center, shaped almost like it was meant to receive something. And Daniel's gaze lowered instinctively to the key, still resting in his palm, the metal warm now from his grip, no longer just an object, but a continuation of everything that had led him here. And for a moment he hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of understanding, because he realized that each step he had taken so far had not been about uncovering something hidden. It had been about becoming someone ready to see it, and that thought settled into him with a quiet weight, grounding him more than any certainty ever had. And behind him, Rex shifted slightly, his nails making a soft sound against the floor, not impatient, not restless, just present, a steady reminder that Daniel was not alone in this, that whatever path had brought him here had included both of them from the beginning. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath steady, before stepping closer and aligning the key with the indentation, the fit immediate, exact, as if the two had never been separate. And when he turned it, the response was subtle, a soft internal movement, followed by a faint click that seemed to echo deeper than the walls should have allowed. And for a second, nothing else happened, the room holding its breath, the silence stretching just long enough to make him question whether there would be more. And then the door shifted, not swinging open, but releasing itself with a slow, controlled motion, revealing a narrow space beyond that felt different from everything else he had seen so far, not just in structure, but in presence. And Daniel stepped forward carefully, the flashlight beam moving ahead of him, illuminating a smaller room, more contained, more deliberate, and at the center of it stood a single wooden table, simple but solid, its surface clean, almost untouched by dust, and on that table rested one object, placed with such precision that it immediately drew his focus, a small box, darker than the one he had opened before, its surface smooth, its edges sharp, as if it had been preserved not just from time, but from intention itself. And Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly, not with fear, but with recognition, the kind that comes before understanding. And he stepped closer, each movement slow, measured, as if the space itself demanded it. And when he reached the table, he paused again, letting the moment settle, the quiet pressing in around him, not heavy, not oppressive, but present in a way that made everything else fade. And he placed his hand on the box, the surface cool beneath his fingers, and for a brief second, he closed his eyes, not thinking, not searching for answers, just allowing himself to feel the weight of where he stood, the path that had brought him here, the losses, the silence, the years spent moving without direction, all converging into this single point. And when he opened his eyes again, there was no hesitation left, only clarity, and he lifted the lid, the motion smooth, the hinge making no sound. And inside, there was no clutter, no collection, just a single item resting in the center, a folded piece of paper, thicker than the others, its edges sharp, its surface clean, as if it had been placed here recently, though Daniel knew that was not possible. And he picked it up carefully, unfolding it with steady hands. And as his eyes moved across the lines written there, something inside him shifted once more. Deeper this time, not just recognition, not just direction, but purpose, clear and undeniable, because the words did not speak in riddles, did not hint or suggest. They told him exactly what he needed to know, not about the place, not about the hidden rooms or the keys or the maps, but about himself, about why he had been brought here, about what his grandmother had seen in him long before he could see it in himself. And as he read, the room seemed to expand, not physically, but in meaning, the walls no longer containing him, but holding him, anchoring him in a truth he had spent years avoiding. And behind him, Rex let out a slow breath, the sound soft but steady, and Daniel lowered the paper slightly, his gaze unfocused for a moment as he absorbed what it meant, because whatever this was, whatever had been left for him, it was no longer just about what he had found, it was about what he was meant to do with it. And that realization did not overwhelm him, it steadied him, in a way nothing else ever had, like a compass finally aligning after years of spinning without direction. And as he stood there, the faint light of the flashlight casting a soft glow across the table, he understood that this was not the end of the path, not even close. It was the point where the path truly began. Daniel did not read the paper again right away, even though the words lingered in his mind with a clarity that refused to fade, because something about the moment demanded stillness, not movement, as if understanding was not meant to be rushed but allowed to settle, to take root in a place deeper than thought. And he lowered his hand slowly, the folded page resting lightly between his fingers, his gaze drifting across the small room once more, seeing it differently now, not as a hidden space filled with objects, but as a carefully prepared threshold, a place designed not just to be found, but to transform the one who found it. And the air itself seemed to carry that intention, quiet but present, like a held breath that had finally been released. And behind him, Rex stepped forward just enough to close the distance, his presence grounding without interrupting, his amber eyes calm, steady, reflecting. The same quiet certainty that had guided them from the moment he first stopped at the basement door. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the sound soft but steady, before folding the paper carefully and placing it inside his jacket, close enough to feel its presence, not as a weight, but as something anchoring. And for a moment, he simply stood there, letting the silence speak in ways words could not. The faint hum of the underground space surrounding him like a distant memory that was only now becoming clear. And then, without urgency, without hesitation, he turned and stepped back toward the narrow doorway, the small room behind him no longer feeling like something hidden, but something completed, as if it had served its purpose the moment he understood what it held. And as he moved back into the larger chamber, the beam of the flashlight revealing the shelves, the documents, the map once more, he realized that nothing here had changed, and yet everything felt different, not because the space itself was altered, but because he was. The quiet confusion that had followed him for years replaced now by something steadier, something that did not demand answers but offered direction. And Rex walked beside him, matching his pace without needing to be called, his movements calm, purposeful, as if the path ahead was already understood. And Daniel paused briefly at the map again, his eyes tracing the marked lines with a new awareness, seeing not just locations, but connections, a network that extended beyond a single place, beyond a single moment, something his grandmother had built with patience and intention, something that had remained unseen not because it was hidden, but because it had not yet been time for it to be seen. And Daniel felt a quiet sense of respect settle into him, not just for what she had created, but for the way she had trusted that he would one day find it, not by chance, but by becoming the kind of person who could recognize it. And that realization did not overwhelm him. It steadied him, grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar but right. And he turned away from the map, the beam of light shifting as he moved toward the corridor, the path back no longer uncertain, but clear, each step carrying a sense of continuity rather than return. And as they walked, the space around him seemed to hold a different kind of silence now, not waiting, not expectant, but complete, like a chapter that had reached its natural end. And when they reached the base of the stairs, Daniel paused once more, looking up toward the faint outline of light far above, the opening to the world he had left behind only hours before. And yet it felt distant now, not in space, but in meaning, because the man who had stood outside that house with nothing had not been the same man who stood here now, and the difference was not measured in what he had found, but in what he understood. And Rex placed one paw on the first step, then another, beginning the climb without looking back, and Daniel followed, the sound of their movement soft against the narrow walls, each step carrying them upward, out of the quiet depth and back toward the open air. And when they emerged into the clearing once more, the light felt different, brighter, clearer, even though the sky remained the same muted gray, and the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying that same faint whisper he had noticed before. But now it did not feel distant or unclear. It felt familiar, like something he had always known but had only just learned how to hear. And Daniel stood there for a moment, the cold air sharp against his face, the key still resting in his pocket, the paper close against his chest, and Rex beside him, steady and calm. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel did not feel like he was searching for something. He felt like he was moving toward it, step by step, guided not by certainty, but by a quiet trust that the path ahead had been waiting for him long before he ever realized he needed to find it. Daniel did not start the engine right away, even after he and Rex returned to the truck, because something in him resisted the idea of moving too quickly, as if the moment needed space to settle, to root itself before the world rushed back in and tried to reshape it into something ordinary. And he rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel, his gaze fixed ahead on the narrow path that had brought him here. now seeming less like a road and more like a line drawn between two versions of himself, one who had arrived empty, uncertain, carrying the weight of everything he had lost, and one who now sat quietly, not full, not complete, but aligned in a way he had not been in years, and beside him, Rex shifted slightly, letting out a slow breath as he settled into the seat, his presence calm, unwavering, the same steady companion who had followed him through places far louder and far harsher than this. And yet here, in the quiet, his role felt different, not just a partner, but a guide, a witness to something that had never needed words to be understood. And Daniel reached into his jacket, pulling out the folded paper once more, the coordinates now less like a destination and more like a beginning that had already been fulfilled, and beneath them, the sentence still carried its quiet certainty. When you find this, you are ready. And Daniel turned the words over in his mind, not questioning them, but letting them settle deeper, understanding now that readiness was not about having answers, but about being willing to follow where they might lead. And he folded the paper carefully again, placing it back inside his jacket. And this time, when his hand moved to the ignition, it did not hesitate, the engine coming to life. With a low, familiar hum that grounded the moment in something real, something steady, and he guided the truck back onto the narrow path, the tires crunching softly over the gravel as they retraced their way out of the clearing, the trees parting slowly behind them as if closing a door that had served its purpose. And as they drove, Daniel noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The landscape did not feel the same, not because it had changed, but because he had. The fields no longer appearing empty, the road no longer uncertain, everything carrying a quiet sense of connection that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. And the drive back to the house passed in a silence that no longer felt heavy, but thoughtful, the kind of silence that holds meaning rather than absence. And when the house came back into view, standing as it had before, worn but steady, it no longer felt like a place he had returned to out of necessity. It felt like a place he had chosen, and he parked the truck, the engine settling into stillness, and stepped out into the cold air once more, Rex moving beside him without needing direction. And together they walked toward the door, the same door that had once felt like an ending, and now felt like a beginning. And as Daniel stepped inside, the house greeted him with the same quiet presence, but it was no longer waiting. It was simply there, solid, complete. And he moved through the room slowly, not searching, not expecting anything new to appear, but noticing the way the light filtered through the windows, the way the floorboards carried the faint marks of time, the way the air held a sense of memory that no longer felt distant. And when he reached the living room, he paused, his gaze drifting once more toward the basement door, not with urgency, not with curiosity, but with understanding, because whatever it had held had already given him what he needed, and there was no pull to return, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had been found. And Rex lay down near the doorway, his body relaxed, his eyes half closed but still aware, as if keeping watch in a way that required no effort. And Daniel moved to the window, looking out at the land beyond, the trees swaying gently in the winter wind. And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to imagine not just where he had been, but where he could go, not in terms of distance or direction, but in purpose, in meaning, in the quiet work of building something that would last, something that would matter beyond the moment. And he reached into his pocket, feeling the key still there, its presence steady, no longer a mystery, but a reminder, a connection to something larger than himself, something he was now a part of, whether he fully understood it or not. And as the light outside began to shift toward evening, the sky deepening into softer tones, Daniel stood there, not searching, not waiting, but present, fully present in a way he had not been in years. And in that stillness, he realized that whatever came next would not be something he stumbled into by accident. It would be something he stepped into with intention, guided not by certainty, but by a quiet trust that had finally found its place. Within him, morning arrived slowly, not with urgency, but with a quiet unfolding of light that filtered through the old windows in thin, pale lines, settling gently across the worn wooden floor, as if the house itself was waking in its own time. And Daniel stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee warming his hands, the faint steam rising in soft curls that disappeared into the still air. and for a long moment he did nothing but stand there, listening, not for sounds that demanded attention, but for the subtle presence that had begun to reveal itself in the quiet, the kind of presence that does not speak loudly but stays, steady and patient. And Rex lay near the doorway, his body relaxed but aware, eyes half open, tracking the slow rhythm of the morning as if it were something worth paying attention to. And Daniel took a slow sip of the coffee, the bitterness grounding, familiar, a simple contrast to everything that had shifted inside him the day before, and he found himself thinking, not about what he had discovered, not about the hidden rooms or the map or the key, but about the feeling that had followed him back from the clearing, that quiet sense of direction that did not demand urgency, but offered clarity. And he set the cup down on the counter, the sound soft against the wood, and stepped toward the living room, his gaze drifting once more to the window, where the land beyond stretched out in muted tones of winter, the trees standing still against the pale sky. And for the first time, he did not see them as empty or lifeless. He saw them as part of something ongoing, something that continued whether he noticed it or not. And that realization settled into him with a quiet steadiness, the kind that does not fade when the moment passes. And Rex rose slowly, stretching before moving to Daniel's side, his tail low, his movements calm, as if acknowledging that the day ahead was not about searching for something new, but about beginning something that had already been set in motion. And Daniel reached into his jacket, his fingers brushing the folded paper and the key, their presence no longer surprising, but grounding. And he walked to the small table near the window, placing them down carefully, not as objects to be examined, but as tools to be used when the time came. And he stood there for a moment, looking at them, the simplicity of their appearance contrasting with the depth of what they represented. And then he turned away, his attention shifting not back toward the basement or the past, but toward the house itself, toward the work that needed to be done, the small things first, the things that anchor a place. And he moved through the rooms with a quiet purpose, opening windows just enough to let the cold air circulate, brushing dust from surfaces that had been left untouched for too long, not in a rush, not with the urgency of someone trying to fix everything at once, but with the steady pace of someone who understands that change happens one deliberate step at a time. And Rex followed him from room to room, occasionally pausing to sit or lie down, always within sight, his presence constant, reassuring. And as the hours passed, the house began to feel different, not transformed, not restored, but awakened, the air shifting slightly, the light settling more naturally into the space. And Daniel found himself moving more easily, his thoughts clearer, his actions guided not by habit, but by intention. And at one point he paused near the front door, his hand resting lightly against the frame. And he looked out again at the road that stretched away from the house, the same road that had once brought him here with nothing but uncertainty, and now seemed to offer something else entirely, not answers, but possibility. And he stepped outside, the cold air sharp but invigorating, filling his lungs in a way that felt almost new. And Rex moved beside him, standing quietly as Daniel looked out over the land, the trees, the open sky. And for a moment, there was no need to think about what came next, no need to plan or predict, because the path had already begun, not out there somewhere in the distance, but here, in the quiet work of rebuilding, in the simple act of staying. And Daniel felt that truth settle into him with a calm certainty, the kind that does not demand attention but remains steady beneath everything else. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying that faint whisper he had come to recognize, he understood that whatever had been left for him was not just something to find. It was something to live, step by step, day by day, in a way that would carry forward long after this moment had passed. And he stood there a little longer, not waiting, not searching, just present, the quiet around him no longer something to endure, but something to trust. The second morning did not arrive with the same quiet hesitation as the first. Instead, it carried a subtle sense of movement, as if the stillness of the house had shifted into something more awake, more aware. And Daniel felt at the moment he opened his eyes, not as a thought, but as a presence, something steady beneath the surface of everything else. And he sat up slowly, the early light stretching across the room in soft, pale lines, the air cool, but no longer heavy. And for a moment he simply listened, not for anything unusual, but for the absence of the old weight that had once filled every silence. And it was gone, replaced by something quieter, something grounded, and Rex was already awake, lying near the foot of the bed, his ears flicking slightly as Daniel moved, his eyes lifting just enough to meet Daniel's before settling again, calm, certain, as if he already understood that the day ahead would not be like the ones before. And Daniel swung his feet to the floor, the wood cool beneath his boots, and stood there for a moment, taking in the room not as a place he had returned to out of necessity, but as something that now belonged to him in a way that extended beyond ownership, something that held history, intention, and now, direction. And he moved through the house with a steady rhythm, not rushed, not hesitant, simply moving from one task to the next, reinforcing what had begun the day before, small repairs, clearing spaces, letting light reach corners that had been hidden too long. And with each action, the house responded in subtle ways, the air shifting, the lights settling more naturally, as if the structure itself recognized the care being given to it. And outside, the sky stretched wider than it had the day before, the clouds thinner, allowing a softer, warmer tone to reach the land, and Daniel stepped onto the porch, pausing there as he looked out over the trees, the road, the quiet expanse that now felt less like isolation and more like possibility. And Rex joined him, standing at his side, his posture relaxed but attentive, his gaze scanning the distance with that same quiet awareness that had guided them from the beginning. And Daniel rested his hands lightly on the railing, the wood worn smooth by years of weather and time. And for a moment he let himself stand still again, not because he needed to, but because he could, because the stillness no longer felt like something to endure, but something to understand. And as he stood there, a thought surfaced, not urgent, not demanding, but clear, the map, the network, the places marked beyond the house. And Daniel felt a subtle shift inside him, not pressure, not obligation, but readiness, the kind that grows quietly until it becomes undeniable. And he stepped back inside, moving with purpose now, not rushing, but no longer lingering. And he retrieved the journal, the one that held the detailed entries, the records of places and names that had once seemed distant, and he set it on the table near the window, opening it carefully, his fingers tracing the pages with a familiarity that had begun to form. And as he read, the connections became clearer, the markings on the map aligning with the notes in the journal, each entry pointing not just to a location, but to a purpose, places where something had been left, maintained, protected. And Daniel understood then that what his grandmother had built was not a single secret, but a system of quiet stewardship, something meant to endure beyond a single lifetime. And that understanding did not overwhelm him, it steadied him, anchoring him in a role he had not expected but now could not ignore. And Rex moved closer, settling near the table, his presence constant, as if confirming that this path was not something Daniel would walk alone. And Daniel closed the journal slowly, his hand resting on its cover for a moment before he looked up, his gaze moving toward the door, toward the road beyond it. And for the first time, the idea of leaving did not feel like escape. It felt like continuation, a step forward rather than away. And he reached for the key once more, the familiar weight settling into his palm, and he slipped it into his pocket alongside the folded paper, the two objects now inseparable in meaning. And as he stood there, the house around him quiet but no longer waiting, he understood that the next part of this journey would not be found beneath the ground or hidden behind walls. It would be out there, in the places marked, in the work that had been left unfinished. And as the light outside grew stronger, filling the room with a steady glow, Daniel took a slow breath, not bracing himself, not preparing for something unknown, but simply acknowledging what was already true, that the path ahead had begun the moment he chose to follow it, and that whatever lay beyond would not be something he stumbled into by chance, but something he stepped into with intention, guided by a quiet trust that had finally found its place within him. The decision did not arrive with noise or urgency. It came quietly, the way morning light settles across a floor without asking permission, and Daniel felt it as he stood near the door, the journal closed, the key resting in his pocket, the folded paper pressed lightly against his chest, all of it no longer separate pieces, but part of something that had begun to align within him. And for a moment he did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that this step, this simple act of walking out that door, was not about leaving the house behind. It was about carrying it forward in a way he had never expected, and Rex stood beside him. Already alert, his posture calm but ready, his eyes fixed not on Daniel, but on the space beyond the door, as if he could sense the direction before it was taken, and Daniel reached for the handle. The wood smoothed beneath his hand, and opened it slowly, the outside air meeting him with a quiet clarity, cool and steady, carrying the scent of pine and earth, and he stepped out, not with hesitation, but with a deliberate calm that came from knowing he did not need to see the entire path to take the next step, and the truck waited where he had left it, unchanged, familiar, a reminder that some things remained steady even as everything else shifted, and Rex moved ahead of him, circling once before stopping near the passenger side, glancing back briefly as if confirming that Daniel was still following, and Daniel allowed himself a small breath that almost felt like a smile, not of amusement, but of recognition, because this quiet partnership, this unspoken understanding between them, had been guiding him long before he had realized it. And he climbed into the driver's seat, the engine coming to life with a low, steady hum, and as he pulled onto the road, the movement felt different this time, not like leaving, not like escaping, but like stepping into something that had been waiting for him to arrive, and the road stretched out ahead, familiar in shape but different in meaning. Each turn no longer uncertain, but part of a direction he had chosen, and the journal rested on the seat beside him, open now to a marked page. The next location circled with a small, precise line, the handwriting steady, confident, and Daniel glanced at it only briefly, not because he doubted it, but because he no longer needed to study it to trust it, and the miles passed with a quiet rhythm, the landscape shifting gradually, the trees thinning, the land opening into broader stretches of field and sky, and the light grew stronger as the day moved forward, not harsh, not overwhelming, but clear, the kind of light that reveals rather than hides. And Daniel felt that same clarity settle into him, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady presence that had been building since the moment he first stepped into the basement, and Rex remained still beside him, his gaze forward, his ears shifting occasionally, as if tracking something just beyond the visible. And after some time, the road narrowed again, turning off into a smaller path that led toward a cluster of old structures barely visible through the trees, and Daniel slowed the truck, his attention sharpening not out of caution, but out of awareness, because he recognized the feeling now, that subtle shift in the air that marked a place of significance. And when the structures came fully into view, they did not appear abandoned, but quiet, preserved in a way that suggested they had not been forgotten, only waiting, and Daniel brought the truck to a stop, the engine settling into silence, and he sat there for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his gaze steady, not searching for answers, but acknowledging that this was the next step, not because he had been told to come here, but because everything within him now aligned with the path that had led him forward. And Rex moved first, stepping out of the truck with a calm confidence, his body language relaxed but attentive, and Daniel followed, the ground firm beneath his boots, the air carrying that same faint sense of stillness he had come to recognize, not empty, but full of something waiting to be understood. And as he stood there, looking at the place ahead, Daniel realized that the journey he had begun was not about uncovering something hidden once and for all. It was about continuing to step into what had already been set in motion, to follow the quiet thread that connected each place, each moment, each choice, and to trust that what had been left for him was not just a gift to receive, but a responsibility to carry forward. And he took a slow breath, the air steady in his lungs, before stepping toward the first of the structures, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with the calm certainty of someone who finally understood that the path ahead did not need to be forced. It only needed to be followed. Daniel slowed his steps as he approached the first structure. Not because there was anything threatening about it, but because something about the place asked for stillness, the same quiet respect he had felt before each threshold he had crossed, and the building itself stood simple and weathered, its wooden frame aged but solid, as if it had endured not by resisting time, but by accepting it, and the door, slightly faded but intact, rested closed with a kind of calm that did not suggest abandonment, only patience, and Rex moved ahead of him, not rushing, not pulling, just walking with a steady purpose that matched the rhythm Daniel had come to trust. And when the dog reached the steps, he paused, looking back once, not asking, not warning, simply acknowledging that this moment belonged to both of them. And Daniel gave a small nod, more felt than seen, before stepping forward and placing his hand on the door, the wood cool and familiar beneath his palm. And when he pushed it open, it did not resist, the hinges moving smoothly as if they had never forgotten how, and the space inside revealed itself slowly, not grand, not overwhelming, but intentional, the kind of place that had been cared for in ways that did not require attention. A long wooden table at the center, shelves along the walls, and windows that allowed the daylight to settle gently across everything. And for a moment, Daniel stood at the threshold, not entering fully, not holding back, simply allowing himself to take it in, because this place did not feel like something new. It felt like something continued, a part of the same quiet system he had begun to understand. And Rex stepped inside first, his movement calm, his nose lifting slightly as he traced the air, then lowering again as if confirming that everything was as it should be. And Daniel followed, the sound of his boots soft against the wooden floor, the light shifting slightly as he moved further into the room. And as he looked around, he began to notice the details, tools placed with care, not scattered, not forgotten, but ready, records stacked neatly along the shelves, their edges worn but preserved. And on the far wall, another map, smaller than the one below the clearing, but marked in the same precise hand, connecting this place to others, to a network that extended beyond what he could see from here. And Daniel felt a quiet understanding settle deeper within him, not as a sudden revelation, but as a continuation of what had already begun, that this was never about finding a single hidden treasure. It was about stepping into a responsibility that had been carried quietly across time. And he moved closer to the table, his hand brushing lightly across its surface, feeling the smooth grain beneath his fingers. And for a moment, a memory surfaced, not clear, not fully formed, but present. The faint echo of his grandmother's voice, not in words he could repeat, but in the feeling she had always carried, a calm certainty, a trust in things that did not need to be explained. And Daniel let that feeling settle, not trying to hold it, not trying to understand it fully, just allowing it to be there. And behind him, Rex sat down near the doorway, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, as if marking the space as safe, as complete. And Daniel turned slightly, his gaze moving between the objects in the room, the map, the records, the tools. And he understood then that this place was not waiting for him to uncover something hidden. It was waiting for him to continue something already in motion, to take what had been preserved and carry it forward in his own way. And that realization did not come with pressure. It came with clarity, a quiet sense of belonging that did not depend on where he had been, but on where he was now. And he took a slow breath, the air steady and grounded, before moving toward the shelves, his fingers tracing the edges of the records, feeling the weight of what they represented, not just information, but care, intention, time. And he understood that each place, each step along this path, was not about accumulation, but about connection, about maintaining something that mattered beyond any single moment. And as he stood there, the light from the windows shifting slightly as the day moved forward, Daniel felt something settle fully into place within him, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but purpose, quiet and steady, the kind that does not demand recognition but remains constant regardless. And he glanced once more toward the open door, toward the path that had led him here, and then back to the room, to the space that now stood open to him. And for the first time, he did not feel like he had arrived at the end of something. He felt like he had stepped into the middle of it, into a story that had been unfolding long before him and would continue long after. And as he moved deeper into the room, beginning not with questions, but with action, small, deliberate steps that would carry this place forward, Rex remained near the doorway, watching quietly, his presence unchanged, steady as it had always been. And in that stillness, Daniel understood something simple but lasting, that what had been left for him was not just a miracle, it was a trust, and that sometimes the greatest things we inherit are not what we keep, but what we choose to carry on.